Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 102 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. Members, just a quick housekeeping. You all should have received a budget from the clerk's office last evening. And just looking around to see if it's the will of the committee to adopt a supplementary travel budget. Everybody was received? Okay, I see everybody's nodding in the right direction. Okay, great. So that's adopted. And now, pursuant to Standing Order 108 Bracket 2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, September 21st, 2023, the committee is commencing its study of policy decisions and market forces that have led to increases in the cost of buying or renting a home in Canada. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Although this room is equipped with powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause some serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling these earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of the interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses with us here today. So, from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, we have Chief Economist Bob Dugan with us, as well as Deputy Chief Economist Aled Ab Yorwith, and Director of Client and Development and Government Relations, Chris Woodcock. From the Department of Finance, Assistant Deputy Minister for Federal Provincial Relations and Social Policy Branch, Alison McDermott, has joined us, as well as Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for Financial Sector Policy Branch, Nicholas Moreau, Assistant Deputy Minister Tax Policy Branch, Mr. Janovich, and Julie Turcotte, who's the Acting Assistant Deputy Minister, Economic Policy Branch. And from the Office of Infrastructure of Canada, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Community Policy and Programs Branch, Janet Goulding. So we are going to start off with up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, and I believe from CMHC we have Mr. Bob Dugan is going to be doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So thank you for the invitation to speak to this committee once again on behalf of Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. La SCHL est heureuse d'offrir au comité son expertise.
CMHC is pleased to offer the committee its trusted expertise, experience, and knowledge on the housing market. As this committee certainly knows, Canadians are struggling to pay their mortgages or rent. House prices have been escalating for some time. Now, inflation, higher interest rates, and record levels of household debt are making matters worse. More potential home buyers are staying in the rental market. This has led to extremely low vacancy rates in most cities and towns, and as a result, a significant rise in rents. There are many factors leading to Canada's housing affordability challenges, but the single biggest factor is a severe housing shortage.
Of about 2 million homes across Canada. Basic economics of supply and demand are coming into play here and driving the house prices and rents higher. Our studies show that to reach affordability by 2030, we need an additional 3.5 million more homes than we currently are on track to build. But building that many homes would cost at least $1 trillion. That's more than governments could ever hope to spend. Yes, the federal government can continue to play a major role in supporting more community or social housing for low-income Canadians. But we need private sector capital, and so governments need to create the conditions necessary to attract that investment into housing. There are some federal programs in place to incentivize this. For example, the Rental Construction Finance Initiative provides low-interest loans for developers at the early stages of the project. New measures like the Housing Accelerator Fund, the new GST exemption for the construction of purpose-built rentals, and the unlocking of new financing for this through the Canada Mortgage Bond Program are examples of such initiatives. Still, we need to do much more, and we must do it in collaboration with the private sector, which currently provides more than 96% of rental housing in Canada. There are certainly challenges faced by some renter households, such as rent evictions and security of tenure. We can't minimize these, nor suggest that they're just the cost of doing business. They aren't. Every one of those cases is a personal crisis for a real household. But these are all symptoms of a larger problem of supply shortage. And what we truly need is for all levels of government to come together around a policy framework, one that encourages the private sector to produce the right kind of supply while also respecting tenants' concerns and best interests. These policies also need to address other barriers to supply. For example, they can encourage the construction sector to innovate better building techniques, make supply chains more reliable, and address labor shortages in the trades. As many people have said, housing affordability is a complex problem. Targeting the investors who provide the overwhelming majority of the housing stock in Canada is not a solution. Rather, we need a comprehensive and coordinated effort that combines private investment, social responsibility, and government solutions. The perfect storm of these three elements can bring about transformative change and improve housing affordability for everyone living in Canada now and in the future. And now I'd be happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Dugan, and there'll be a lot of opportunity to answer many questions. And now we're going to the Department of Finance, and I believe, Ms. McDermott, you'll be speaking on behalf of your team.
Merci. Merci de me donner l'occasion.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. We've been introduced already, so I'll start. We are delighted to be here to discuss with you the issue of rising housing costs and public policy measures to address this problem.
It is obviously a major issue in Canada. While there are many dimensions to the challenge, our overall assessment is that affordability remains stretched primarily because supply has not been able to keep up with strong demand, consistent with Mr. Dugan's views. Encouragingly, there are record numbers of new housing units under construction in many cities across Canada, meaning that builders are responding to this challenge. But the scale of the issue is great. You heard the numbers from Bob about the 3.5 million additional housing units that would need to be built to restore affordability by 2030. And so that increase will be challenging and needs to overcome significant barriers to ramping up construction. Municipal rules and practices like restrictive zoning, high development fees, long approval times, these are widely recognized as a major impediment to this needed supply. And supply chain bottlenecks and labor shortages are also increasing the cost and the time that it takes to build a home. Nous savons que ce défi ne peut pas être...
We know that this challenge cannot be solved by one level of government alone. It will require strong, coordinated efforts by home builders and governments at all levels. The federal government has taken a comprehensive series of measures to meet these challenges and ensure that new affordable housing is available to Canadians. However, these measures to stimulate supply will take time to take full effect. To help solve the problem of municipal barriers, among other initiatives, the government has launched the $4 billion Housing Accelerator Fund, which helps encourage and support municipalities to remove municipal barriers to housing and stimulate the creation of new housing.
Comme vous savez,
As you are aware, the government also recently tabled a bill to implement a major tax change aimed at increasing the supply of rental housing. The proposal will temporarily eliminate the GST on new rental housing built for this purpose. This measure has been in effect since the 14th of September 2023, subject to adoption of this legislation.
housing affordability is a multifaceted issue that affects all Canadians. The department is continually studying housing affordability issues and the effects they may have on financial stability and housing costs. To address concerns that property flipping is driving up the cost of housing, Budget 2022 introduced new rules to ensure that profits from properties held for less than 12 months are fully taxed, with certain exceptions for unexpected life events. Afin de garantir que le logement
to ensure that housing is owned by Canadians rather than foreign investors, the 2022 budget announced a 2-year ban on non-Canadians buying residential property in Canada. The ban came into effect on the 1st of January 2023. The 2022 budget also included tax measures to make housing more affordable for first-time home buyers. It enhanced the first-time home buyers tax credit and introduced the new first-time home buyer savings account, which financial institutions began offering this year.
is another important part of the government's comprehensive suite of solutions to build more homes in Canada. Earlier this week, the Minister of Finance announced an increase in the annual limit for Canada mortgage bonds from $40 billion to up to $60 billion, which will be designated exclusively for funding mortgage loans on multi-unit rental projects insured by CMHC. This measure will increase access by developers and builders to cost-effective financing for multi-unit rental construction, which will in turn help to build up to an estimated 30,000 more rental apartments per year. The government recognizes that rapid increases in interest rates have made it harder for some Canadians to make their mortgage payments. That's why the government has taken steps to ensure that federally regulated financial institutions are providing Canadians with fair and equitable access to mortgage relief measures appropriate to borrower circumstances. Notably, in July 2023, the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada published its guideline on existing consumer mortgage loans in exceptional circumstances following a public consultation process, which will assist financial institutions in adopting fair and consistent approaches when they offer relief measures to Canadian consumers. Finally, the government is continuing to invest in affordable housing through the $82+ billion National Housing Strategy, which includes more than $48 billion in federal support for the construction and repair of rental housing, affordable housing and shelters, more than $15 billion in allocated joint funding with provinces and territories, more than $11 billion to support community and social housing, nearly $4 billion allocated for Reaching Home Canada's homeless strategy, and more than $3 billion in additional National Housing Strategy supports, including the one-time top-up to the Canada Housing Benefit. Alors, comme vous pouvez le constater, le gouvernement a...
As you can see, the government has implemented a wide range of measures to address various aspects of the affordable housing challenge. I'm delighted to be joined by colleagues from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation and Infrastructure Canada, who are leading the National Housing Strategy programs, as well as colleagues who were already introduced before. So we look forward to answering your questions.
Ms. McDermott, and we do have a lot of officials here with us today. And just before we get into our rounds of questions, so for members, if your question is not specific to one of the witnesses, what I'd ask from the witnesses, whoever is best suited to answer the question, if you could step forward or answer, and if you can just let everybody know who you are and the department that you represent. So on that, we are going to move to our first round, and each party will have up to 6 minutes. We're starting with the Conservatives, and MP Moritz, I believe, is up first. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of you for being here today. I have in front of me a report from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, a multi-sector approach to end Canada's rental housing crisis. Any of you familiar with this particular report? Okay, so it's a very interesting report, and I have to admit I haven't read the entire thing, but I'm going through it. One of the authors is Tim Richter, the president and CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Nahat Nenshi, former mayor of Calgary, is a participant in the report. And what caught my eye, there's a number of recommendations, but what caught my eye was recommendation number 3. And I'll just read it to you. It says, the federal government should help reform CMHC fees and the federal tax system, including changes to capital cost provisions and eliminating the GST, HST on purpose-built rental housing to incentivize the construction of purpose-built rental housing. And then it goes into some detail, A through F. And A is the removing of the GST on purpose-built rental housing, which the government has now introduced legislation to do. There's a number of other recommendations here that I wanted to get your opinion on, and to find out whether you've done any analysis of these recommendations. So, for example, one of them is to defer the capital gains tax and recapture depreciation due upon the sale of an existing purpose-built rental project, providing that the proceeds are reinvested in the development of new purpose-built rental housing. That recommendation comes from a report entitled Encouraging Construction and Retention of Purpose-Built Rental Housing in Canada. Do you have any thoughts about that particular measure, any analysis that you've done?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your question. We do, in tax policy, continue to look at different potential approaches to try to alleviate the issues that we're facing with the housing market. Over the recent couple of years, we've announced a number of measures, in part to deal with some aspect of speculation, and more recently, as you mentioned, to try to encourage supply of rental housing through the GST rental rebate exemption. With respect to specific proposal, I'm not really in a position to necessarily go into the detail as to the state of our advice and analysis. But I mean, these proposals we are fully aware of. I have to admit, this one is not necessarily new per se, but I guess my general answer is we're looking at everything basically.
Okay, so you have some analysis on it. The C in this recommendation is to increase the capital cost allowance, CCA, on newly constructed purpose-built rental buildings above 4%. Have you had a look at that one?
Thanks again for your question. I believe my answer is the same. I'm not really in a position to go into the detail on each one and where we are.
It's fair. I'm not asking for detail. I just want to know if you've worked on it.
As I previously said, we are looking at everything in the tax system in respect to the tax treatment of housing, capital gains, including capital cost allowance as well. So it's a broad review.
So the next point in this recommendation is that, and I have to admit this is something I don't know a lot about, but it's more for CMHC. It says CMHC should examine the point system in the MLI Select program. Do you know what that is?
CMHC's commercial.
I'm just going to interrupt. If witnesses could just identify themselves just before you kind of get into your answer, and for the members and those watching. Thank you.
In the recommendation that this program is for new construction to increase the number of purpose-built rentals that are affordable. So it sounds like an important recommendation.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the reminder. Chris Woodcock from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Our MLI Select program was introduced fairly recently. with extensive demand. It is based on a point system that attributes different social outcomes will result in a greater score. I'm not familiar with the specific recommendation in the report that you're looking at, but it's definitely being looked at in terms of calibration to make sure that it's effective.
That's good to know. I appreciate your telling me that. Now, the next one is when selling to a nonprofit operator, land trust, or nonprofit acquisition fund, provide a capital gains tax break to private owners of multi-purpose rental. This initiative would incentivize selling to nonprofits and protect affordable purpose-built housing. So in other words, you get a capital gains tax break if you sell to a nonprofit. Is that something that you've done any analysis on in your department?
Mira Jovanovic, tax policy at Finance. Maybe, like, I don't want to repeat necessarily my previous answer.
Happy if you want to repeat.
But I mean, again, I mean, when we look at a tax system, the way you can use the tax system is to try to see how you can change relative prices of things and make things a bit more attractive or less attractive depending on the objectives you want to pursue. Another important consideration is the incidence of what you're doing really. And when you get into a transaction like that, you have to understand who's benefiting.
I'm down to my
that's
last.
One thing, and where is that?
Fine.
I am
We're
done.
just over 6 minutes, yeah.
Oh, I'm over 6 minutes?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
we just went
Sorry,
over.
I had, well, maybe I'll get back.
There'll be other
Thank you.
opportunities. MP Morantz, yeah. So we're going over to MP Baker now for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you all for being here today. Over the course of the summer, I spent time knocking on doors in my community in Etobicoke Centre. And I consistently heard from folks about the challenges that they're facing or their family members are facing in finding affordable housing, whether that's housing that they can afford. So whether that be the purchase of a home or whether that be the rental of a home. One of the things that many of my constituents ask me is, why has this happened? Like, why have prices gone up so much? Could I ask you to explain, for the sake of my constituents who are watching, why have prices gone up so much?
Well, thanks, Mr. Chair. And that is a great question. And in our opinion, and based on the analysis that we've done, a lot of it has to do with the fact that supply has not kept up with demand in recent years for housing. And so we estimate that, back in 2004, that's sort of the baseline for a lot of our study on supply gaps. That was a time when affordability was relatively good across Canada, at least from a historical perspective. Since that period of time, a supply gap has grown to reach about 2 million units as of right now, and we project that's going to grow in the years ahead to about 3.5 million units by 2030. And so that supply gap is one of the key reasons why we're seeing a deterioration of affordability. And if something's not done about it, I suspect you're going to be continuing to answer questions from your constituents in the years to come, because as that supply gap gets larger, we're going to see more affordability pressures in terms of ownership housing, but also the rental market, and we can't forget about that. I mean, in Toronto last year, we're now collecting new data that collects data on rents, not just average rents, but we look at rents for folks that stay in the same unit versus rents in apartments that turn over. And in Toronto last year, the rent increase for people who stayed in place was about 2.3%. When a unit changed hands, the rent increase was a little above 29%. And that gives you an idea of what happens when you have a supply-constrained market. People change units for whatever reason, or new people come to live in that market, and they're facing the market that's very supply-constrained, and that drives costs higher. So it is a big problem, but one that you need supply in order to fix.
Right. So bottom line, what I hear you saying is we don't have enough homes for all the Canadians who need one. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And to solve that problem, what I hear you saying is we need to build a lot more homes as quickly as possible.
That is a key message that we're putting out there, yes. A lot more construction in order to alleviate this supply gap and restore affordability for Canadians.
Right. Okay. Because if we build more homes and we address that gap that you're talking about of 2 million homes in Canada, then presumably that will have a positive impact on prices of homes.
Hopefully what that does is that sort of stops the erosion in affordability and leads to an improvement. And that not just home prices, but I like to emphasize that we care about rental markets as well, because we often talk about home prices as being a big driver of the erosion of affordability. But when I think about one of the things that concerns me more is in the rental market, home ownership is more of a choice, and when you have higher income, you can make that move from rental to home ownership. But for folks that are in the rental market that are there because their income is low, where do they turn when they can't afford the housing that they're getting? And so to me, the bigger concern, or the one that keeps me up at night, is the deterioration in affordability in the rental market more, because we're talking about lower income Canadians that need more help.
Yeah. So there's a lack of affordability for those looking to purchase a home, and there's a lack of affordability for those looking to rent a home. Bottom line, and we got to build more homes to make sure that that homes become more affordable in both those categories. Okay. Let me ask. I've got, I think, 2 minutes left, and I think I'll direct this to the officials from the Ministry of Finance, if I may. In the context of what we've just talked about, one of the things that the government recently proposed is the GST rebate on the construction of new homes. Could you explain, again, for the benefit of my constituents who are watching, how is that going to help, or how is that meant to help address the affordability challenge and the supply gap that we just spoke about?
Thank you for your question, Miro Jovanovic, Tax Policy. That's an important question. It's an important measure. It is, I would say, mainly targeted at reducing the cost of construction of rental buildings, rental housing. How it does so is by providing an exemption of the GST upon the completion of these buildings, which is the current system, basically. Depending on how whether an exemption, the 36% rebate that exists now, depending as to whether it is claimed or not, the current GST rate may vary between 3.2% and 5%. So this proposed measure would eliminate that. So it would give a break of between 3.2 and 5%, effectively. And also, what is important to understand is that GST right now is assessed on the basis of the fair market value of the building upon construction, not the construction cost. It's fair to assume that the fair market value would be higher than the construction cost. So when you rebase everything on the basis of the construction cost, that benefit could be significant.
That makes sense. So what I hear you saying, and I've only got about 15 seconds, so I'll just make a comment, and there's a yes or no answer, perhaps, if you can, which is, what I hear you saying is the GST rebate will make certain projects that weren't previously financially viable, viable. In other words, incenting those who are building homes to build more homes.
That is the idea, and it is in consideration of the recent increase in financing cost over the last year or 18 months, which has been pretty steep. So it would be a way to try to offset that and encourage these investments to happen faster.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Baker. And now questions from MP Sainte-Marie.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. D'abord,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, greetings to our colleagues, particularly Mike Morris from the Green Party, Francisco Sokbaha, Fragis Katos, Peter. It was a pleasure to sit with you on the committee before your promotion. It's a pleasure to see you again. And over here, I hope there's going to be no filibustering. I would like to thank all the witnesses for being here. Your presence is very important to talk to us about the crisis issue that is very worrisome.
j'ai quelques questions techniques concernant.
I have some technical questions concerning updates on the quantity of houses available by 2030. In your basic scenario, you have taken the population, the average population growth over the past 10 years. But when we look at the statistics, this average seems to have changed, and it seems permanent now. In the press today, it's said that the population growth is unprecedented since the baby boom. You have to go back to 1967 to see such high rates, especially when you factor in temporary foreign workers and temporary students. Mr. Dugan, do you find that the basic scenario when it comes to immigration predictions or the size of the population are already outdated?
Dugan, CMHC, and maybe I'll start and I'll turn it over to my colleague here, Aled, who was the actual author of that report. But, you know, when you think about our approach to estimating the supply gaps, I mean, you raise an important point about population growth, which is a key assumption. But also a key to our approach is to include economic variables as well, because traditionally when you just use demographics to project the needs for housing, those approaches always tend to undershoot. And so we try to augment that approach by using economic factors such as income growth, interest rates, those kinds of things, to come up with a better estimate of supply gaps. Now, when you look ahead, I mean, when we looked at our population projections, we used information that we had available on, the immigration targets that existed. And then beyond that, we went to sort of a Statistics Canada's population projection. But we did try to look at alternative scenarios, one with higher population growth, in order to assess, well, what could be some of the upside risk in terms of how large could that supply gap get if population growth was stronger. And we also had a lower growth scenario to give an estimate of what it might be if we had sort of slower economic growth in the years ahead. And that's important. I mean, we include those economic projections, and that might add a little bit of volatility to our estimates, and so having a range is useful, but I still think it gives you a better estimate than ignoring the economic factors. Now, Elliot, if I maybe pass it over to you, if there's maybe more that you'd like to add on our assumptions.
I'll up your CMHC. I don't think there's much to add. I mean, the baseline scenario was basically current government policy on immigration until 2025, and then, as Bob said, the reversion to prior growth rates. So that's why we did an additional scenario with higher growth in population until 2030.
Merci beaucoup pour ces précisions. Madame.
Thank you very much for those clarifications. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. I'm sorry. If we repeated that exercise with a scenario of a population growth rate by 2030 using figures from Statistics Canada today, are we not going to even exceed the scenario that presents a fast-growing population? We have the capacity to examine that issue. Yes, the variation could even be greater. Considering the figures that have been provided by Statistics Canada today and considering the government's commitment to increase the threshold of immigration over the next 10 years, if we take that scenario, the result could be different and could be more than the population growth projected. Is it very complicated for you to give us an update, including the growth rate over the past year, and then you send it to the committee? It will take a few weeks. Furthermore, we need to meet the department responsible. We have to look at the demographic factors and the economic factors. Yes, we can do so. So you are overwhelmed with work, that is clear. What is important primarily is to meet the housing financing needs. I understand you don't have the staff you need, but if you're able to find time to respond to this request, it will be much appreciated. Mr. Chair, how many minutes do I have left? 4 minutes, 10 seconds. So I will conclude with that. Thank you very much for the information provided. Thank you.
To MP Blakey, whose motion actually got this study on housing started. So MP Blakey, floor is yours for questions for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to start just by asking Mr. Duggan, in respect of the Canada Mortgage bonds, are the Canada Mortgage bonds offered at the same rate as a Canada Savings bond, or do they pay a different interest? And if so, do you know what the difference between interest on a Canada Mortgage bond and a Canada Savings bond is?
I've not compared them to Canada Savings bond rates. I can say that they tend to trade at a slightly higher yield than Government of Canada bonds, and there's probably a better answer that I could get from Nicolas if you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Nicolas Moreau, Department of Finance. So when we look at the cost of financing a CMB, a Canada mortgage bond, basically we usually compare them to the Government of Canada rate, or GOCs. And they're currently trading on a 5-year rate around 30 basis point above, so a 0.3 percentage point, and 40 basis point if it's a 10-year loan. We need to understand that the CMB are usually financed into the 5-year and 10-year sectors. 10-year sectors are mostly for multi-unit project, 5-year for the residential housing. In terms of Canada saving bonds, they've been completely canceled many years ago. We do not issue Canada saving bonds anymore at the federal government. So basically, we only have like a stock of Canada saving bonds that are gradually fading out right now in the market.
Okay, but the federal government does issue its own bonds. At what rate does it issue them compared to the CMHC?
Thank you for your question. Basically, like I said, we're issuing our own bonds around 30 basis point below CMHC in the 5-year sector and 40 basis point below in the 10-year sector.
Okay, and so when the federal government wants to finance the construction of new housing, what is it getting for that differential between the two rates? If it's ultimately paying more interest out on the CMHC bonds, what is the advantage to government or to the taxpayer for paying that extra as opposed to issuing a Government of Canada bond at a slightly lower rate?
This is a good question. Thank you for your question. Basically, the way the program works right now, the CMB program, so CMHC manages program. They issue Canadian mortgage bond to the market at a rate of, like I said, 30 or 40 basis point above the GOC rate. But they go on the market and buy what we call NHA MBS. So those are there's pool of mortgages that are basically bought back from issuers, the banks. And by doing that, they're increasing the liquidity in the market. By increasing the liquidity, those banks are able to provide lower rates to builders. So or to homeowners, basically. So this is an implicit subsidy that is being provided by CMHC through that program.
Now, CMHC recently announced they'd be issuing another $20 billion of bonds annually in order to be able to provide low cost financing, I should say, for multi-unit rental construction. I'm curious to know, are there any affordability conditions attached to that low cost financing, or is that $20 billion of low cost financing being made available to developers who would be charging market rent?
So that's a good question. Once again, Nicolas Moreau, Department of Finance. Basically, that $20 billion will be focused exclusively on the multi-unit. So a builder could build an apartment building, a student apartment, or all-age, residence. There's two basically phases to this program. There's one which is the normal stream where any builders could apply, but the other one is what we already talked about, the MLI Select. So if you come with specific criteria on affordability, on if it's a green initiative, you'll be able to get specific points that will reduce the loan of the cost of that financing to CMHC. So there's more benefit.
But affordability isn't a hard condition of that stream. It's just one of the factors for scoring. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I am curious to know, my understanding is that beyond the kind of current Rapid Housing Initiative offering, there's no commitment by government to a subsequent offering. I understand that the co-investment fund has been depleted, and that these are the two funds under the National Housing Strategy that nonprofits can access if they want to build social or affordable housing. Just wondering if I'm a nonprofit today with the wherewithal and the ambition to build affordable or social housing, what current pots of funding are available to me to apply for at the present moment?
Chris Woodcock from CMHC Housing Programs. At this time, the Rapid Housing Initiative has gone through 3 phases. Phase 3 is fully awarded, and so there are no further funds available at this time. We are continuing to accept applications through the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. We continue to work with nonprofits across the country. We are looking towards the end of those funds, and we are certainly optimistic that we'll see further availability of funds in that space over the long term. But right now we have low interest loans and grants that continue to be available through Co-Investment Fund.
And thank you, MP Blakey. That's the time. So we are moving members into our second round of questions, and we're starting off with MP Chambers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I want to follow up on actually a couple of my colleagues' questions, but first with Mr. St. Marie was talking about demand. Most people aren't willing to admit that to close the supply gap is almost fantasy land. So we have to think about demand. Now, you went down talking about population growth, but how about the uses of property? How many properties in Canada today are now used as, say, short-term rental? Does CMHC track that data? Does it have access to that data? Is that something it wish it had?
So thanks for that question, Mr. Chair. I mean, with respect to short-term rental, I mean, when you think about it, of course, those are units that are not available for, long-term residential uses. The counter side to that, though, is these are maybe units that wouldn't be built if the availability of short-term rental wasn't there in the first place. And so the higher returns to putting out a unit in short-term rental probably incentivized a lot of purchases of units that then maybe wouldn't have been built had that demand not been there for those units. So at this point in time, there's kind of maybe a potential windfall. If you were to sort of take those units and say, okay, we're going to get rid of short-term rental, that could increase supply to the rental market as a one-off, but it wouldn't necessarily lead to continued growth in supply in the long run because, because the rules have changed and now the incentive to invest in those units is gone.
Indeed, totally agree with you. But I think we're at a point in time where everyone's acknowledging a crisis and a one-off release. I mean, there's some studies that suggest just in the city of Toronto alone, 10,000 units, because the city started to actually regulate short-term rentals, have been released to the market. But if you're telling me that the government doesn't have that information and would like that information, maybe that's something the committee could request. I'd like to hear from some short-term rental operators. These are individuals that are sometimes operating out of single-family detached dwellings. They're not all just condos. Yes, that's a part of it, and I'm sure that's a big piece. The second question, I'll just stay with you, Mr. Dugan, if that's fine. Do you have CMHC have any analysis on the recent changes to the building code or proposed changes to the building code from NRCan about how much additional cost that adds per unit to housing?
So I will say that we don't have any analysis that I'm aware of. It's not done in sort of the area that I'm responsible for.
Can I make a suggestion? We should want to know how much additional cost per unit is being loaded onto because of government regulation. Not saying where the regulation isn't needed, but we should understand and make the trade-off. We're talking about reducing the GST on rentals, and that's going to be so monumental change. 5% change. Some studies suggest that the NRCan changes are going to add $30,000 per unit in additional costs. I mean, that's a significant amount, which is all borne by the purchaser. So I would submit that that's a piece of analysis that would be very helpful for the committee. I would like to follow up on Mr. Blakey's questions about the CMB program, if I can, Mr. Morrow. Does the Department of Finance have any analysis or any projection on what will happen to prices with the injection of liquidity into the market?
Thank you for your question, Nicolas Moreau, Department of Finance. Basically, we're adding $20 billion in liquidity in the CMB program. This is a program of $260 billion right now. The Canadian market is a very liquid market, and these are AAA bonds, basically fully backed by the Government of Canada. So we don't believe that this will have an impact or any significant impact on the yields that are offered right now.
We are increasing liquidity, right?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. But you're also trying to wind down the CMB program. Is that not true at the same time?
Thank you for your question. What we've done as part of the last budget, we announced that we will be consulting the market on a potential consolidation of the CEB program on the Government of Canada bond program. Those consultations happened last summer. We're currently looking at the potential, the answers that we receive, and this is where we are right now.
Thank you very much. I don't have time for an answer, but I'd just like to make a request. Can the Department of Finance provide an explanation of what is going on between OSFI and FCAC? OSFI's September 13th bulletin says that you have to go through the B20 rules on a refinance. FCAC says you can extend amortizations. Those are at complete opposite purposes. I'd just like to understand what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Chambers. And now to MP Weiler for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and really appreciate the testimony from our witnesses already today. I do want to pick up on a line of questioning from my colleague, Mr. Baker. And this is a question for Mr. Duggan from CMHC. I was hoping you could share with this committee your estimates on the impact on new purpose-built rental projects that'll be built as a result, or if Bill C-56 passes and GST is eliminated on purpose-built rentals.
Well, thanks very much for that question. Now, this being very new, we haven't had much of an opportunity to produce any estimates on the impact of that, and so we don't have anything. All I have is anecdotal evidence that a lot of builders seem to be suggesting that this can put many projects sort of go from unprofitable to profitable, and so I've seen some announcements by some builders that, in the news, the same news that you probably read, that this will result in more units, but we don't have an estimate right now of how many units that could produce.
Thank you. Yeah, I've seen some reporting out there, for instance, from the Smart Prosperity Institute, that it could be 200 to 300,000 more purpose-built rental units. Maybe I'll just ask the same question for the Department of Finance, if they might be able to shed some light on that.
Miro Jovanovic. I do not actually. I think that at this point, I would not have anything to add to the answer already provided. Thank you.
Okay, maybe continuing on with the Department of Finance, you mentioned in your opening some of the tax measures that have been brought in and other measures to deal with the financialization of housing, such as the tax on property for flipping, the ban on foreign buying for 2 years. And the other areas, of course, are the tax on property assignments. And I was hoping you might be able to speak a little bit more to the impact you foresee on that, and actually the existing experience so far, given that many of these measures have gone into effect as of January 1st this year.
Miro Jovanovic again. Thanks for your question, Mr. Chair. With respect to assignment sales, there are two proposals, actually measures that are in place that are affecting the tax treatment. First, with respect to the GST application, the government has clarified and that the GST will apply in all situations, in all assignment sales. So that's one thing. With respect to the income tax treatment, the tax treatment of assignment sales that have been done within 12 months has also been clarified, actually, that in all situations it would be deemed to be a business income and fully taxed, as opposed to benefiting eventually from potentially from a capital gains treatment. With respect to the effect of these measures on assignments, it is too early to say anything. We, as you suggested, it has been put in place relatively recently, so we don't have data on that yet.
Great, thank you. And the one other area is change in the tax treatment for short-term rentals. And just given that my colleague, Mr. Chambers, brought that up, I was hoping you could maybe shed a little bit more light on that for this committee as well.
Thank you for your question. With respect to short-term rental income, I'm not aware of a change in the tax treatment. Maybe you can add a bit of clarity to your question. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I can identify what you're suggesting.
Okay, maybe I'll change course a little bit here. The department mentioned the first-time home savings account that's been brought in. I was hoping you might be able to share with the committee just the take-up we've seen on this new measure that's been brought in.
Yes, thank you, Mira Jovanovic again. So it's been in effect since, I believe, April 1st, and we've seen reasonably good take-up so far. I believe it's about 14 institutions right now offering it. Most of the big six do also offer that. I believe maybe two of them are in the process of, like they're about to. They may not be available right now, but based on their communications, it seems that it's coming shortly. Thank you.
And now to MP Sainte-Marie for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. For Mr. Dugan, on another topic, I will be starting from a specific case to ask a general question. In Joliet now, we have social housing projects. For one of those projects, the land on which the building is being project is co-managed by the Quebec Housing Authority and the CMHC, and the CMHC has received an order to sell the building at market prices. And so there's an obstacle to that construction. From what we've heard, the CMHC is ready to give away the land because it's landlocked and cannot really be used for much. And when you have the order to transfer or sell a land that doesn't belong to you at market price, according to public finance legislation, if the minister gives you an authorization to transfer the land or to sell it, can you sell the land below market price? Excellent question. I do not have the answer. Let me ask Chris. Can you answer that question?
OK, merci beaucoup. Donc, on attend.
Thank you. We'll be waiting for your answer with great interest. Now, I don't necessarily have the right term in French. The Accelerator Fund, we've heard about $900 million for Quebec, and it would appear that that fund is not yet active. So what's the problem? What does it require for people in Quebec to receive that money from the federal government so that low-cost housing can be built?
Nous avons une expérience.
We have had very recent positive experiences with the Quebec province. We have signed agreements to distribute federal funds to the province. We are working closely with Quebec to find an agreement concerning the Accelerator Fund. I am confident that we will find a solution soon, probably this year. And the result?
This year, hopefully sooner, that gives Quebec an appropriate share of those federal dollars and that achieves the kind of long-term improvements to systems and processes that accelerate housing in Quebec.
OK, on a hâte que ça se concrétise. Merci beaucoup.
It's good to know that it's becoming concrete. Thank you.
MP Blakey for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Just a quick callback to earlier. I know a colleague had asked about the number of rental units that government projects the GST exemption will help to create, and that those numbers don't yet exist. But I wonder if either the department or CMHC could commit to preparing an estimate for the committee and delivering it in time for our study, which is projected to report back to the House in February. So I think to be maximally useful, some kind of analysis would be welcome by the end of next month, let's say. Is that a realistic request of either party at the table today?
Thank you for your question or request. I have to admit it's difficult for me to commit at this point on this. What I would say is that this would be an exercise that would be extremely complex, that may take a while to arrive at assumptions that make sense. Given the complexity of the issue, there are so many factors at play. We know for sure that we're going in the right direction in terms of reducing building cost. As I mentioned, it's between 3.2% and 5%. That's a GST value. And some provinces may also jump in. So it would be an extremely difficult exercise, and I wonder whether the number we would end up with, based on the quality of or lack of quality of assumptions, because of the lack of data, would really be informative.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that if we want to measure the opportunity cost of certain kinds of investment in housing, whether that's, kind of through tax policy or direct spending, that government's plan is to wait to have data and only be able to evaluate that retroactively. Is that a fair understanding of the approach to evaluating value for money?
In the specific case of the GST rebate, we would need to determine whether we would be able to retroactively assess, because again, it suggests that retroactively what has been the determinant and the increment, which I think it's back to my first response, is that it is an awfully complicated exercise. That does not mean we cannot come up with estimate. I guess the caveat I'm putting here is that I have doubt about the quality and reliability of these estimates.
Okay, a simpler question.
Blakey, that's the time. So we've gotten to the time. Yeah, and just members, when you're hearing an answer from a witness, if you could just put yourself on mute, because we've heard from the interpreters it causes some interference and some challenges. So we're off to MP Lawrence for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses appearing today. I read from the CMHC's mandate here to promote the efficient functioning and competitiveness of housing in the finance market. So while I'm pleased that we have acknowledged the issue, one that our party has been pointing out for some time, I'm not nearly as pleased, in fact, profoundly disappointed that we've gotten here. We're 2 million homes behind, going to be 3.5 million homes. Did the CMHC, did the Ministry of Finance advise the government 8 years ago that this issue would be occurring?
Thank you very much for that question, and a fair one. We've been, and look, I have my colleague Aled here that led a lot of this work. In 2018, we published a fairly extensive study on house price escalation. And I think that, to my knowledge, is probably one of the first pieces of work that really identified supply, or the lack of supply, as a key determinant of the escalation in house prices. Aled, I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Sure. Aled Apiora, CMHC. Yes, Bob is right. The report was published in early 2018. To summarize briefly, it said, yes, demand for housing is going up because of rising income, rising population growth, and at the time, lower interest rates. But there were significant supply responsiveness challenges, particularly in the Vancouver area and the Toronto area.
Thank you for that. So since 2018, has the problem stayed the same? Has it improved, or has it gotten worse? Has the housing crisis worsened since 2018?
Well, I think it's fair. We're moving in the wrong direction in terms of affordability, and affordability has gotten worse. Now, supply, we think, is the solution. Unfortunately, supply takes time. And so, for example, in the Toronto area, if you want to build a multi-residential rental building, from the time you have the idea that you want to do that till people are moving in, it can take 8 years. And so those kinds of supply lags are some of the reasons why things like the Housing Accelerator Fund to look for efficiencies. We always say that we need to find innovative ways of building and innovative solutions so that we can get supply on the ground more quickly because it is a problem.
Thank you for that, sir, and I agree. We definitely need more supply. With respect to barriers for that supply, have you published or do you have available or could you make available to the committee the additional cost or barrier that arise from changes to the building code that changes from the impact of municipal, whether slow releasing or just not releasing or other municipal barriers? And finally, what the impact of the carbon tax would be on the cost of building homes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bob Dugan, CMHC. I am not aware of any studies that we have that quantify those measures right now, and so I don't think I have anything that I can provide. I can check when I get back to see if there's anything that's been done. The only thing I can maybe point to is there was a recent survey done by Statistics Canada that outlined some of the key local level impediments to supply. It doesn't qualify in terms of additional cost, but it identifies some of the things that are some of the, at the local level, some of the impediments that are have the biggest impact on the supply response.
Thank you for that. So it's your position then in 2018 that CMHC at least started to lay out the issue to the government, and I know you can't jump into partisan politics, and I wouldn't ask you to, but it has been your evidence that despite that report in 2018, the housing crisis has worsened. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then secondly, my colleague, Mr. Chambers, referred to hitting the target of 3.5 million additional homes as fantasy land. Given the GST rebate and the current actions, if we looked on trajectories, is anything changed that would, in your mind, give any Canadian confidence that we would bridge that 3.5 million home gap?
The 3.5 million is an enormous undertaking, and it's not something that CMHC can do alone, that the federal government can do alone. It's basically an all-hands-on-deck effort that has to happen with the private sector, different levels of government. I think it's a very ambitious goal. It's going to be difficult to attain, and I don't see how we'll attain it with the current environment. So, we have high interest rates, high material costs. The unemployment rate has come up a bit, but it's still only 5.5%. It's very low. There's not a lot of labor. We need to come up with very innovative ways to build using existing capital and labor in order to get this job done. And so because this is innovation that hasn't happened yet, it's hard to point to a solution. But it's going to be difficult, but hopefully we can do it because it's an important objective, because affordability is so important.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Lawrence. And now to MP Zarowitz, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to finish off with that, just because I think there seems to be an implication that in 2018 there's a report that came out. All of a sudden now we are in a worse crisis situation because the Government of Canada didn't listen to that 2018 report, and that I do not believe is true. Can you confirm that the housing crisis we have today is one of probably inaction for about 20 to 30 years of all levels of government, which is how we've reached the situation today? Would you agree with that, Mr. Dugan and Mr. Ab-Eorwith?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Bob Dugan, CMHC. I think you're quite right to point that out. The affordability has been deteriorating for much longer than just since 2018. And I would say that as a result of a lot of our work, I think a lot of the focus of discussions around policy to solve housing has shifted from a lot of demand-based initiatives before then to more focus on supply. So I think there's been responsiveness, but as I said earlier, unfortunately, supply takes time, and you can't just create it out of thin air.
And then can I also have you confirm that since 2018 we had a massive global pandemic, we've had major global shifts, we've had huge inflation, we've had a number of factors that have impacted the ability for any level of government to actually move as aggressively as possible on a lot of the housing initiatives that were originally planned. Can you confirm that that is true?
Very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Absolutely, it's been a challenging environment in recent years for all the reasons you've mentioned.
Thank you. And then we're talking about the financialization of housing. And if I said to it's one of the things we're talking about right now. And if I said to a Davenport resident, what do you think financialization of housing means? I'm not quite sure they would know. Can you confirm that it means it's basically buying housing as an investment versus as a place to live?
So that's a very broad definition of it. And what I think is very important to recognize is financialization of housing has been around for a long time. When, like earlier in my opening remarks,
Define it. Define it for the average Canadian.
So I was agreeing with your definition that,
Okay.
you know, if you buy housing as an investment as opposed to using it for shelter, that could be an example of financialization for housing. There are many definitions, and different people use different definitions. That's one I like to work with, and there's probably some merit in coming up with some standardized definition that we all agree with. But I think it's important to note that financialization, when you look at the rental market, 95% or so of the market is owned by investors, the rental market, so it's not government provided, it's investor provided units, and that is the most affordable part of the housing market. And so we need more financialization. We need more investment dollars in order to increase the rental supply, because I think that's where the affordability crisis is the most acute.
Okay. Because I think a lot of people feel that when people are buying housing as a way to invest, it tends not to benefit Canadians in general. So there's a general thinking around that, versus the need to actually have private investment help to actually create additional spaces. So do you see there's a little bit of disconnect, I think, for the average Canadian? Can you maybe sort of find a way to sort of maybe explain what is it that we're actually looking for from the private sector?
Well, so thank you very much for the question, Bob Dugan, CMHC. I think what we're looking for the private sector is more investment dollars making its way into the construction of more units. I think it's very important to also point out that, you know, a lot of the issues around affordability when people talk about financialization, and when you think about the lack of affordability and people will blame financialization, really the lack of supply, I think, is the main issue that's creating the affordability crisis. And so we have to encourage more investment in order to get beyond this and have more supply so that the market is supplied well enough to get shelter costs back in line with income so people can afford the units they live in. Solutions that don't encourage that investment, I fear, can lead to short-term improvements, possibly in affordability, but in the long term, if they discourage investment, we never get the supply we need to restore affordability on a sustainable basis.
And I'm just my last question is, I was very shocked to hear that rent increases when people are changing units of 29% versus they stay in the units 2.3%. It's at the provincial level that they can actually have some sort of a rent control for the changing of units. Is that correct? So it would be at the provincial level they could actually manage that.
Yeah, it's a provincial level jurisdiction to set rent controls.
And they don't have that in place right now for the change in units.
So in Ontario, so I gave the example for Toronto where the rent increases was 29% for people for units that change hands, and that would be sort of rent control that's just, you know, set by the province of Ontario. So the current approach in Ontario is to set a guideline for units where people stay in place, but rent can change and move up to what the market can bear in cases where a unit changes hand during the year.
Can control that if they'd like.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's their jurisdiction.
Okay,
Thank you, MP Zarowitz. Members, witnesses, we're moving into our third round, and we're starting with MP Howland for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. My first question is in relation to the IMF announcement about Canada being the most indebted, not only the most indebted in the world of households, but now there's a real risk of mortgage default crisis happening. And we know through the Governor of the Bank of Canada, who said that, you know, government deficits make it harder for them to fight inflation. And we also know through the current finance minister that deficits fuel inflation, which make interest rates go up. We've seen inflation go up again up to a 4%, double what the rate it should be just currently. And that could have another impact of having another interest rate hike. I'd like to have both Finance Canada and CMHC give your thoughts on this looming crisis, which seems like it's going to be massive.
I can start, Bob, CMHC. So you bring up some concerns that we also share and things that we monitor very closely, in particular with respect to household debt. Now, we keep an eye on that because, Canadian households do have a very high level of debt compared to many other countries. And that is a vulnerability that can make us more susceptible to a downturn. If some sort of shock leads to higher unemployment in Canada, the fact that we have a lot of household debt can make that downturn a lot more severe in Canada than it would be if household debt were lower. And so that's a concern we always share. Luckily, with respect to mortgage defaults, so far, when you look at arrears rates, they remain very, very low. I think the latest number is about 0.25%. And so they've...
There, but would you also, we haven't really seen the full picture yet, though, because some of those renewals are going to start now, and in some cases, double, triple of what people were paying is going to be their new rate, and which is why IMF has identified this as a default crisis. Is that a factor that you think, if we're looking forward, isn't that a bigger concern?
And thank you very much for the question. I was just about to get there. With the interest rates, so the Bank of Canada has tightened from about 0.25%, as of March of last year in 2022, have now tightened up to 5% in terms of their policy rates, with the risk that they could go higher for sure if inflation continues to or persists. These are things that are going to lead to, and have already led to, increases in variable interest rates on mortgages, with people reaching their trigger rates and having to either face higher payments or get behind on their amortization. So eventually that's going to lead to, a reset of mortgage payments that could be, more difficult for many households. Luckily, the mortgage rate stress test was in place that protected against some of that increase. So most households that got a mortgage in the last, I don't have the exact start date, but last 4 or 5 years have had to qualify at a rate that's about 200 or more basis points above the contract rate.
Fair enough, but and I'd like to get Finance Canada's thoughts on this too, but we're not looking at just a 5% increase. I mean, banks are could be up to 6 to 7% on what their mortgage rates would be for variable rate mortgages. And when people are going to go and renew, put the stress test aside, what's going to happen to those people that won't be able to renew? What's that going to do to the market? What's that going to do to our economy?
Right, and so it's certainly a risk. A lot of these households are going to have to dedicate more of their income in order to pay those debt service costs. I've been answering this a lot. I don't know if the Department of Finance wanted to weigh in with anything on that, but...
Thank you for your questions. I'm Julie Zocat from the Department of Finance. Yes, it's true that many households are going to face some financial pressure in the coming years, right, as they renew their mortgages. So what we know is that so far a third of households have seen their mortgage payments go up. So that will increase next year to about 2/3. I think some mitigation factors that the labor market has remained quite strong. So we haven't seen the unemployment increasing by a whole lot. Income growth is also quite solid. So
sorry, I wanted to get in one more question to both of you before I end. My question is that we recently found out the government lost track of 1 million people. There's no surprise, but is there any change in your opinion on what that would do to the supply and the demand side of this housing crisis that we're in?
So I believe we were talking about that a little bit earlier in terms of the recent numbers and what does that do to our projection of supply gaps between now and 2030. And I think time permitting, I think what we committed to do is try to see if we could come up with an estimate of how that might change our estimate of the supply gap. Now, we do have a high population growth scenario that results in a supply gap of about 4 million units by 2030, which compares to our 3.5 million units in our base case scenario. I guess the question is, would, under these assumptions of higher population, would the estimate go even above 4 million? I don't have an answer for that right now, but it's something we can try to look into.
Could you table that, please?
Thank you, MP Howland. And now over to MP Sorbara, and welcome, MP Sorbara, to committee.
Thank you, Chair. It's great to be with my esteemed colleagues, and welcome to all the CMHC officials today. Mr. Duggan, thank you for your frank assessment of the Canadian housing market, and you've been the economist at CMHC for a very long time, so you've seen what I would call a few housing cycles and where we are now. Where would you characterize, if you had to just think about where we are in the housing cycle in Canada?
Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Speaker. And so that's a great question about where we are in the cycle right now. I mean, we're in an environment, of course, where interest rates have come up, and that's been dampening housing demand, especially home ownership demand. And so we do, think that well, obviously in the past year or so since interest rates have come up, we've seen a little bit of downward pressure on house prices. That doesn't mean housing is more affordable, because with the rise in interest rates, mortgage carrying costs have been higher. But in terms of the housing cycle, what worries me is, in the short term, with higher interest rates, we might see, less robust housing market conditions than we saw, say, before interest rates came up. But in the longer term, and my bigger concern is, because of the lack of supply, is that the long-term trend in housing markets is for a deterioration in affordability, where rents and prices continue to increase. And so there's the short term, and there could be some relief because of short-term cyclicality, but in the long run, I really worry about affordability and price increases because of the lack of supply.
Yeah, and if I can add, I think the normalization of rates that's happened and is happening both on yields on both sides of the border, at whatever part of the curve that you want to look at. I think that's why the move and the announcement yesterday before to increase the size of the CMB program, which is very liquid. I think the number was 200 and some odd billion debt outstanding, backed by Canada's AAA credit rating, with very, very good assets and good performing assets behind it, was very significant to incrementally build another 30,000 units. I believe it was 30,000 units in rentals. On top of that, lifting the 5% GST, which with, I think, some of the provinces have come on board to remove the HST portion, so you're not just getting the 5% uplift, you're actually getting up to the double digits, which is great. I think the gap in the supply and demand, which exists right now, is just a stock and flow number, right? We have a stock of housing, and it takes time to build, but we have a flow of demand which we're trying to catch up on. Can we catch up?
So that's a great question. I have to believe that we will eventually, with all the efforts that are being made, but it's going to be a challenge, and I think it'll be a real big challenge to build the 3.5 million units by 2030. I think I've said that, and I don't know, Aled, if you want to add to that in any way, but it's a hard goal to achieve.
I'll add about CMHC. I think the one encouraging sign is that now, after these recent reports, everybody's starting to talk about supply, and supply is getting the focus and the attention, and we think this is where the solution lies.
If I can just add on another tangent, at this moment in time, there are more cranes in the city of Toronto than in any other North American city. And actually, you can combine a couple North American cities, and they still wouldn't reach it. In my area, in the city of Vaughan, there are an area where the subway has gone to. We've gone from a population of 0 to where there'll be 40,000 people within the next couple of years, and there are cranes everywhere and being built. So I do want to do a shout out to the builders out there and all the workers that are building everything across this country, whether the skilled trades from 183 or 506 or the carpenters, IBEW, and all the folks in between. Because they're the folks that are going to have to build this, and they actually do it quite efficiently, and great products are put out to the market to Canadians, whether in the entire housing continuum, from affordable housing down to selling a detached home in the Canadian markets. How much time do I have left? 1 minute. Okay. On the first-time home buyers account that was mandated, it's seeing great pickup it is a demand side function, but I think longer term, it's a great thing. Do we have any statistics of how many Canadians have opened that account?
I don't believe we necessarily have numbers now. I mean, that probably after it may take a bit of time to have that understanding. Like we know what institutions are offering, but we can, I can take that with me and see if there's a way to get some information on this.
Thank you, Chair. I'll stop there. Thank you.
MP Sorbara. And now to MP Sainte-Marie, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question still goes to the CMHC. I have a question. I asked that you provide data distributed by province, the current state of the program that you are managing. How many projects have been announced? How many are under construction? How many doors? And how much is it going to cost? If you are able to provide that information distributed by province, it's going to be much appreciated. Thank you. Another question for you. I referred earlier to something. I'm wondering whether all the programs that the government is asking you to manage for home construction is not what the CMHC used to do historically. That's new, and that's my opinion when I look at what is happening. I imagine it takes a lot of resources to develop new ways of doing business. Does the CMHC have enough resources to carry out this new mandate? Can you also confirm that the projects in the regions that are not urban centers will not be disadvantaged because it takes a lot of time to analyze projects in detail, and you want to focus only on the major projects to gain time? So that's a concern of the resources that are required. Please answer the question.
Chris Woodcock, CMHC Housing Programs. I think so there's a lot in that question. To start, we certainly look at our resourcing on an ongoing basis. We have had a lot of success moving internal resources between programs. For example, just as an anecdote, when we were wrapping up the delivery of the Rapid Housing Initiative this year, we were very successful in retraining and redeploying a significant number of staff from Rapid Housing Initiative to support the Housing Accelerator Fund and developing training to support that work, and the timing worked out. So that's the type of workforce planning that we look at overall. To make sure that we leverage the available resources that we do have in the best possible way and the capacity that we do have as flexibly as we can to support the various programs that we're delivering. Certainly, I would agree with your statement that in recent years we've been delivering many housing programs that are different from historic programs that would have been worked on. The most recent one, Housing Accelerator Fund, is a very different kind of program. Its involvement in municipal processes and regulations is very new to us, and it's certainly a learning process. If you go back a few years, the introduction of the co-investment fund and the rental construction financing initiative, also very new to CMHC. We were able to ramp up very quickly. Again, lessons learned and certainly opportunities to continue refining, but that's been an ongoing process.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Sainte-Marie.
Merci.
Merci.
Thank you.
Now to MP Blakey for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I was hoping that either the department or CMHC could provide the committee with a list of projects that have a social or affordable component that are in part, federally funded in some way, shape, or form, whatever the mechanism, that began construction prior to September 13th, 2023, just to get an idea of, projects that have stalled as a result of higher interest rates. So if those projects are going ahead in any event, so be it. I'm interested in the ones that, because of escalating interest rates, had to pause construction after they began. Is that a list that can be provided to the committee?
Thank you for the question, Chris Woodcock, CMHC Housing Programs. We will take that away, and we will do our best to provide that information. I can't confirm at this time that we would have the lens specifically around projects that have stalled due to interest rates, certainly we can take a look and see what we do have and what we can provide.
And Alison McDermott,
Thank
Department
you
of
very much.
Finance. I'll just add that there is a fair bit of built-in flexibility to a lot of those CMHC projects or programs that would allow them to take small measures to make to improve the viability of individual projects. So I don't think there's a very large list of projects that are stalled at this point. I think what you'd find is funds have been used up faster on fewer projects than may have been originally anticipated.
Okay, well, that's why the list would be very helpful, because we've certainly heard anecdotally from the sector that there are non-profit or co-op housing projects that receive federal funding that have been put on pause just because the numbers don't work on the budget. So I think to have a list of what those projects are, what their value is, and what the federal contribution represents would be useful to the work of the committee. I also wanted to ask, I guess, we know that Canada is the lowest in the OECD for the number of social housing units that it has as a percentage of its housing stock. And so we've heard a lot from the CMHC today about supply and about market supply, but I wonder if the CMHC could speak specifically to the need to increase social housing stock in Canada and what mechanisms they believe are the best mechanisms in order to increase significantly Canada's social housing stock.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. I mean, I can confirm, yeah, we have a low level for the housing stock of social, housing is, I think, about 4% of the housing stock in Canada, which is well below OECD averages. And so I would completely agree that, there's a need to build more affordable or social housing stock, as well as housing stock at, across the continuum in order to improve affordability for all Canadians. But that is most definitely an important part of it. In terms of the mechanisms, that's not my area of expertise to answer, but I can confirm that it is. We have a low stock, and that's something that should improve in order to promote affordability, especially for the most vulnerable households in Canada.
And who within government would you say
MP
it is
Blakey,
the responsibility?
We've gotten to the time, but I do believe that Mr. Chris Woodcock, you do have that information?
I was going to respond on preservation of social housing units. We could provide an answer on that offline.
Okay, if you can provide that to the committee, that would be great. Thank you, and thank you, MP Blakey. And now to MP Morantz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question before I start for you, Mr. Chair. Just wondering if the Finance Minister has accepted our gracious invitation and when she'll be appearing at this committee.
We're working on our schedule. We're working.
Okay, I'll wait for you to advise them. Mr. Duggan, on defaults, again, IMF and The Economist have both basically published that Canada is at actually the highest risk for defaults of any other country in the G7. It's a very serious situation. I note that the Royal Bank published a proof point earlier this year where they said that in particular, this poses a particular risk in 25 and 27 for the group of borrowers that bought a home between late 2020 and 2022 when the market was at its peak and interest rates hit rock bottom. What I'm wondering about is, as a mortgage insurer, this has to be on your radar, obviously. How concerned are you about this? And also, has CMHC done any analysis as to what the loan losses might be? Are you increasing your provision for loan losses on a go-forward basis, given the concerns that might happen over the next couple of years?
So thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Bob Dugan, CMHC. So great question, and so I don't work in the mortgage insurance area. I do know they do stress testing of these kinds of things in order to sort of assess our capital levels. I can sort of try to get back with a more precise answer, but I share the concern that in an environment of rising interest rates and mortgages resetting at higher rates, that there is risk in an environment where Canadians are heavily indebted. So it's something we monitor. It's something we want to have a handle on.
If you can find something on that you could table with the committee, that would be very interesting to have. Now, in my first round, I was asking Finance about various tax measures that would incentivize housing construction, and hearing your comments, it seems to me that's first and foremost on your mind. You want to see more houses built as quickly as possible. I remember when I was a young lawyer, one of the programs at the time was something called the MERB program, the Multi-Unit Residential Building Program, which basically allowed investors who would risk their capital on new builds to write the soft costs and the capital cost allowance off against their personal or professional income. That program in the 1970s and 80s got hundreds of thousands of units built. And that's why I'm harping on these recommendations in Mr. Richter's report, because it seems to me that although it's good that the government is taking the GST off of purpose-built rentals, there's so many other things you could do with the capital gains tax deferrals and various tax credits that are outlined in this report. I'm just wondering if you could, I know the Department of Finance doesn't want to talk about it, but I'm wondering if you could provide your thoughts on those types of measures.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, I have to start by saying I'm not a tax expert, and it's not the kind of analysis that we do at CMHC. And so I think that just as a general statement, I mean, I think it's important to look at all avenues to increase the attractiveness to investors and builders to provide more supply in the housing market. And so I'm in favor of analyzing all of those possibilities to have a handle on how best can we respond to this housing crisis and get units built. In terms of that suggestion versus others, I don't have the infrastructure at CMHC to study those tax estimates, and so I don't have a very educated opinion on one versus the other, but I think
maybe this would be more of an apt question for an economist. Do you think that increasing taxes on those that risk capital to build housing would incentivize more builds?
Increasing taxes would? No, I think the opposite would be the case.
And would you state that as being the obvious?
As an economist, that would be my answer, yes.
Thank you. And we had Professor Lee here, Ian Lee from the Sprott School of Business last week, and he said, it's interesting, I've got his quote here, I want to read it to you. He said, if you look at the sheer magnitude and you accept CMHC's number of 3.5 million housing shortfall by 2030, the idea that governments can handle the majority of that 3.5 million is preposterous. It is going to be fundamentally the private sector that's going to have to be involved for the vast majority of housing that needs to be built. He goes on, but do you generally agree with that sentiment?
Thank you very much for the question, Bob Dugan, CMHC. Absolutely. I don't think the government can do it alone. It's too monumental a task. And so the private sector has to be involved, and we have to, and that explains my position on financialization. I think we have to find ways to incent money to flow into the housing sector in order to get more of it built so that we can supply more housing to Canadians.
Thank you, MP Morantz. We're going now to MP Baker for 5 minutes. And just before MP Baker, just when you conclude, we won't have enough time to go through another round, but we do have a little bit of time. So I'm going to allow for each party to ask one question of the witnesses, and we're going to go in that round before we suspend. MP Baker for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. The measure, we've been talking a fair bit today about the government's plan to provide a GST exemption on new rental builds. There's been a proposal by Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition. He's presented a private member's bill, which has proposed that to provide the GST exemption on new rental builds to only below market units. And so my question is what is the difference, what would be the difference in impact between providing GST exemption only on the new rental builds, as Mr. Poilievre has proposed, versus the plan that the government has put forward?
Thank you for your question, Mio Jovanovic, Finance. I think I'm going to start by replying maybe at a higher level. the policy that has been put, the proposal on the GST exemption put forward by the government is relatively simple. It's simply an exemption, a temporary one, but it's kind of a broad base. There's no phase out. There are no specific conditions other really than making sure that it's directed at purpose-built rental, constructions, and so on. That is made with the intent to ensure that it's not complex. It increases certainty for investors and therefore try to maximize the potential effectiveness of this. So from there, what I would say is that when you start from that basis and you start adding conditions, generally the effect would be to add complexity, uncertainty for investors because they may not know upfront exactly whether they're going to get it or not, and therefore potentially significantly reduce the effectiveness of the measure. So that would be my answer.
So when you say significantly reduced effectiveness, are you saying therefore that it would result in the construction of fewer homes?
Yes, because of that uncertainty, that would be factored typically upfront as part of these upfront decisions by investors. If there's more uncertainty and the likelihood of getting the benefit may be in doubt because of the complexity and uncertainty, that could reduce it. Yes.
So it would have less impact on, if therefore it would build less homes, is what I'm hearing you say, result in the construction of fewer new homes, and therefore do less to address the supply gap that we talked about earlier. Is that correct?
Yes, potentially, yes.
Okay. And so one of the other things I wanted to ask is about, we are here at the Finance Committee at the House of Commons, and you are representatives of, you work within the federal government. But I used to be a member of provincial parliament in Ontario, and I know that when I served as a member of provincial parliament, we had a number of initiatives related to housing, whether that's rules around development and growth plans, whether that's rules that were imposed on municipalities around development, et cetera. There's a whole series of things, incentives to build homes, all that sort of thing. So housing is in my opinion, largely also the jurisdiction of the provinces and the municipalities, because they make decisions, whether it's in terms of regulations or incentives and et cetera, that really impact how many homes are going to get built. So I guess I have a two-part question, and I think we have about 60 seconds left, is, am I correct, is my statement correct, that municipalities and provinces have the most significant impact on the number of homes that we've built across Canada in the coming years to help us address that supply gap? And if so, what can they do to help ensure that we build more homes so that homes become more affordable for Canadians?
Can I?
Yeah, please. I think we have about 60 seconds, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so the short answer to your question is yes, I agree. It's mostly within the provinces and the municipalities. They set the rules, the regulations that roughly determine how many housing units get built. It's obviously the private sector puts a lot of capital up and they want to build a lot of housing, but the rules of the game are set to the most part by the provinces and municipalities. And that's why we conducted a survey joint with Statistics Canada. The results were published in June, July, that looked at regulatory burdens across Canada and found that the burden was quite heavy in the Toronto area and in the Vancouver area, which correlates fairly well with the lack of affordability in those areas. So clearly, anything to accelerate approvals, anything to speed up processes, create certainty, all of those actions would really help. So I think it's one of the concerns that if there were hypothetically tax provisions that would be brought forward, I think builders would still have to face the reality of uncertainty in the regulatory processes at the local levels.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Baker. And as I said, members, we don't have much time, but we want to squeeze as much time as we can out of the witnesses because they've been great witnesses. So it's one question per party. Conservatives, MP Chambers, please.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate the candor. Mr. Duggan, I just want to leave one thing or an idea with you. 40 cents of every dollar today already goes into real estate. We have a productivity problem in the country. If we want to drag more investment dollars into real estate, that's going to create some other challenges. I would submit that we should be looking at the level of retail investment activity in the real estate market. If we want to stop that, you want to release houses. Forget about new construction for a second. Why do we still allow borrowed money for down payments? If we stop that today, we would wipe out a ton of retail investment activity and release units, already built units, onto the market. Thank you.
MP Chambers, PS Bendayan.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'd like to hand over my time to my friend and colleague, Mr. Morris from the Green Party.
Maurice.
Thank you. Very kind. I just think I wanted to start briefly with a brief comment. I'm concerned that in this conversation, the term financialization has been conflated with investments in the housing market. Financialization has led to the loss of 15 affordable units for every one new unit created. My question's for CMHC. I have a local organization in my community who's been waiting for MLI Select insurance since July 2022 that's putting into question a building that would have 60% of the units affordable that has been purchased by the community, whereas at the same time, we have large real estate investment trusts who've received over $1 billion in loans through our CIF, of which 80% of the units could be unaffordable. And so my question is, what can be done at CMHC to better make sense of the program offering so that in communities like mine across the country, we get to report back to say more is being done to address the affordability crisis?
Chris Woodcock, CMHC Housing Programs. I'll just be candid. The MLI Select program is outside of my direct responsibilities, but I do know we're well aware of the challenges with wait times and processing times in that program. We've been putting significant efforts into moving in staff, training staff, upgrading our capacity, shortening the process, and really trying to accelerate that as quickly as we can. There are differences, completely different processes and teams involved between RCFI and MLS Select, but wherever we have the ability, we've been pouring resources in to shorten those timelines for MLS Select, and it is not a prioritization or a distinction between the type of applicant. It's simply a matter of a different program.
Thank you. Thank you.
More. And now over to MP Sainte-Marie for a question.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, thank you, Rachel, for allowing Mike to speak. As a parliament, we need to review our way of doing business so we can fully recognize parties who have less than 12 MPs. That will help our democracy. A question for the Department of Finance. C56, the part that concerns the GST, we've talked a lot about that already. The bill has no precision on the type of building, house, or no affordability criteria to be able to be entitled to the rebate. This bill allows the government to provide precision by regulation. Why didn't we find this criteria in the legislation, which is unusual when it comes to tax policy? Thank you for the question. The decision to work this way was taken by the government, and it was considered to be the best way of proceeding given the context. At the same time, the government communicated its intention in the regulation to define this regulation. For example, we are talking about buildings with at least 4 units with at least 10 bedrooms. And 90% of the buildings should be devoted to rentals. So those are the conditions. Thank you very much.
And so our final question will be from MP Blakey to our witnesses today. MP Blakey.
Yeah, I think I just want to take a moment as well to express concern at the way in which financialization has been described by the CMHC today. I mean, I think for folks that are concerned about turning housing into an asset class first and foremost, as opposed to shelter that all folks in Canada should have a right to, examples of financialization that I think are particularly nefarious have to do with large companies or trusts purchasing buildings where there's already affordable units renovating those suites and evicting tenants that really depended on those buildings to be able to provide affordable rents for the sake of shareholder profit. And we can't meet the needs of housing in Canada if we accept that as a model. So I'm open to hearing it. Like, I do think we need more private investment, but it has to take certain forms. And I think financialization is often used to describe that morphing of housing from shelter to asset class. And so I think this speaks a little bit to what Mr. Woodcock was going to start to speak to. So I'm happy to give him the floor briefly to go back to what he was going to talk about at the end of my last segment with whatever time I have remaining, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chris Woodcock, CMHC Housing Programs. My prior answer, I was simply going to say, through the NHS, we have a bilateral housing framework in place with the provinces and territories. In most cases, decades ago, the federal government transferred responsibility for social housing to the provinces, along with financial resources to support those units over the long term. We have targets for preservation of those units. Those are looked at on an annual basis with the provinces that have signed the agreements. Quebec and PI have not. But we work very diligently with our provincial and territorial partners to make sure that we're preserving at all costs those units. And that is also a big part of the work we do on a regular basis. We could provide some statistics surrounding that as a follow-up.
You, MP Blakey, and thank you to all our officials, the witnesses that were here, answered many questions here today from our members. We had some guests join our committee, MP Morris, we had MP Sorbara, PS Fragascados, and all our regular members. So we thank you for your testimony. This was the first meeting of our study on housing. Thank you at this time, members, and we're going to suspend before we go in camera.